So now there is a Odd Nerdrum exhibition in Oslo, the greatest exhibition ever, actually, of Nerdrum's paintings, more than 60 of them. And you have been there, right?
I've been there 4 or 5 times now.
Yeah?
With different people. I've been there by myself. I also had the pleasure of walking around looking before they opened. So I've been there many times.
And you have...
Have you been there?
Yes, yes. I've been there 2 or 3 times. First time on the opening, it was a bit full of people, but then it's better to go by yourself.
Yeah.
And I'm
also on openings, everyone's looking at the paintings, but very quickly they look inwards to each other instead.
Yeah.
So these openings are really weird because everyone looks at who else is there instead of the paintings. You can't go there on the opening.
But one of the one feedback that many has on the exhibition when seeing all these works, people say they are horrifying in a way, showing a world with naked people and deserted landscape, and many of them find it too dark and depressing.
Yeah,
and
so
I thought we could talk some about images.
I also heard people say it was grotesque.
Yes, yeah.
I disagree. I think it's one of the few exhibitions in a very long time that have actually. I leave every time I've been there. I leave the room with more joy and hope than before. So I'm actually the opposite. I go in there and I look at the pictures, even though the content of some of them can be somewhat grotesque. For one of the paintings, for example, there's some people eating a human, and some people find that grotesque. But the more you look at it, it sort of grows on you as well. Yeah. So the more grotesque the pictures are, the more they actually grow on me, because they're made in a way that with the composition principles and the colors, and they're made in a way which I find soothing as well. So even though the event depicted is somewhat grotesque, the painting is just beautiful. Yeah, and I think that's an art, like have a grotesque image become beautiful.
And it's also something I remember you wrote in the introduction of the new Nerdrum book, that it could be that in classical figuration you're supposed to depict human action, and it can be grotesque but made in a beautiful way.
So this is so the classical part goes back to Aristotle's Poetics, the book he has called Poetics, and there it's mentioned that the primary thing you want to depict in art, in poetry, when you create something, create a story, is human action. So the characters and the people are secondary, and what's actually happening is primary. And so the happening itself could be like a murder or a war, or it could be horrible things. But the classical figurative painting is supposed to depict that in a way that makes it stick, and that makes us want to look at it, and makes our eyes just glued to it and want to see more of it. And you have to make it beautiful to attract that attention, I think. So I'm actually of the opinion that you can't. Some people say, is beauty the point of art? Does every painting have to be beautiful? I think the good ones do. But not the content, not the event doesn't have to be beautiful. It could be horrible acts. But in order for it to become a classic, in order for it to reach the heights of classical figurative art, I think it has to be made in a beautiful way. So the composition has to be beautiful, the coloring and the way it's exhibited, the way the horrible act is given has to be beautiful, because that's how it sticks in history, I think. That's why we want to look at it again and again.
Yeah, and it's also it's also something with these so-called grotesque images are not, or it can be a way of emphasizing the beautiful by making certain, or by having this scenery that is grotesque in a way. For instance, I think the cannibal painting is a very good example of that. I remember Jan-Ove too, who used to sit here.
Used to be you.
Yeah. And he pointed to the fact that you can see all these people eating another human being, but the face or the head of the eaten human corpse is still kept, and it's a beautiful head, and that shows some kind of humanity that is that makes it beautiful, but in a how can I say it without making it too much of a cliche, but in a deeper way. It's it sticks to you in a or it affects you in a much stronger degree, because it's not just beauty, but it's shown in a context.
Yeah, I noticed that too, that the head wasn't eaten. It was the whole body was eaten, but the head was intact.
Yeah. And it's I think it's a good comparison with Raskolnikov by Dostoevsky. He writes about this horrific act of killing two older ladies.
This is in Crime and Punishment?
Yes, in Crime and Punishment. But still he is, Raskolnikov is still depicted as a beautiful character. Yeah. He's disturbed in many ways, but Dostoevsky shows hints of his like true character in a way, and shows the humanity in, although he's a murderer, and that is something that sticks to you in a much stronger degree, that you can see the humanity in something grotesque.
Yeah. I think I agree. I mean, a good example of this is Lolita, the book Lolita by Nabokov. It depicts a human who takes advantage of a younger girl. I think she's 12 in the book, but it's one of the most beautiful books ever written. And it depicts something, I would say, immoral. It depicts something that at times is somewhat even grotesque at times, but you feel sympathy for all of them, for all the characters, and it's written in such a beautiful way and described in such a beautiful way. Even the horrible acts are described in a beautiful way. So the package is so beautiful, even though the content is immoral and wrong and can be grotesque. And I think that's like great art to manage to do that. And I think I think that's so. It shows another point that's very interesting, which is that it separates the aesthetic values from the moral values very well. These cases, so you can depict something immoral, and you can even paint it in a way that's immoral. Let's say you painted it, you ignored your loved ones in order to paint the painting. You do something wrong to create something great, and you depict a horrible act in the painting, and even still, you can get the most beautiful painting ever, and that shows that these are different values. It doesn't get a lower aesthetic value just because there's immoral acts or immoral ways of doing it. So I think these cases show, and I think many of Nerdrum's paintings as well show this, that you can depict wrong actions, you can depict grotesque actions, but if you do it in a beautiful way, it really is. It makes much more room for contemplation. So I think it's very interesting, and that's why I think I told you earlier that when you walk into the exhibition that he has now, there's some paintings I liked right away, and I thought, like, these are the best ones. This is my favorite. And when I've been there 4 or 5 times, there are some others that sort of grow on me more, and those are often the more grotesque ones. So the grotesque ones, they grow on me more, and the ones that are more like immediately likable, I like them still, but the other ones interestingly grow on me. And I think it's the way the grotesqueness is described.
It's interesting that you point out the separation between morality and aesthetics. I think that's very central to bringing back the craft aspect of painting, because that's also if we go back to Aristotle, that's how he talks about technê, that it's the product that is the goal, not the action itself. And if the action is if the action itself becomes the part of the goal, which is for instance that it's made in by not breaking any moral rules or codes, or that it's made in like with a certain kind of message or something like that, then it comes closer to moral knowledge or moral.
But I also think Aristotle is a bit tricky on this, because he has this overarching goal of everything, which is eudaimonia, which is this like happy, meaningful, moral life that we're supposed to lead. And technê is a virtue that you can have, a character trait that's praiseworthy. And then it means you know how to create something, a story or a painting or a house, or how to build and create something, but you also know not just how to do it, which you can learn by looking at others, but you also know why you do the things you do along the way.
Okay.
So, for example, if I'm supposed to make soup, I can know how to make soup by following the recipe. So I can learn how to make soup and follow the recipe, and I can even memorize the recipe. But I still wouldn't manage the art of making soup. I wouldn't have technê, this like skill of being this soup maker, which is a great skill, a praiseworthy skill. But by just following a recipe or memorizing it. But if I follow the recipe to begin with, I learn how to make soup, and after a while I realize why I put these spices in and these ingredients then before that one, and I realize the principles behind what I'm doing when I'm doing it. That's when you achieve this higher state of technê, which is this like character trait of being like then you become the master of soup making. So you're not just the student, but you're now the master of soup making when you learn the principles of why you do the things you do along the way. And the same goes for paintings, right? So you can learn to imitate, you can learn to do what the teachers do, but when you realize why you put that shadow there, and you realize why you put the light there and the cold color there and the warm color there, and you know the principles behind what you're doing, that's when you have the skill or the technê, this which means basically a knowing how or a skill. That's when you achieve that, and that's a praiseworthy skill. And an interesting question is if you can have that and still do it in a horrible way. And that's doubtful. I'm not sure if that's possible. So it might be that when you have the skill and become the master, the way you do things are also done, might be, according to Aristotle, it might be that the way you do it has to have some skill and virtue as well, at least if you want to be the full human of reaching eudaimonia. But it's an interesting question, but I think we definitely should go back to more technê. The skill of knowing how to do it and why. Does that make sense?
Yes. Definitely. And it's a very central point that you point out about knowing why you do things, and that's also a very strength to Odd Nerdrum. Not only the technê, knowing why and how, but also the underlying philosophy. This exhibition is, as you pointed out earlier, it's so grandiose, and it shows a life project, which is not only a project or not only an aesthetic project, but a philosophical project. It's it's really remarkable.
I think it's very. I was thinking about this, whether there's any painter, if you stick to painters, is there any painter in the history that has shown an equal, holistic life project through its art. I think it's hard to find many of them. And especially if you count in what you said, that the philosophy involved in the painting. I mean, the storytelling is one thing, but you have many great painters who have this technê of painting, the technical skills, and they can have a good stories in some paintings, but very often the paintings don't stick together and they don't give a worldview as a whole, all the paintings, the whole corpus. But with Nerdrum you get that. You sort of get a developing, evolving worldview from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, zeros into our time, where the whole vision of the world and the humanity, which is the main focus as far as I can tell, of his paintings, a vision of humanity. You get that through all the paintings as a whole, not just in one vision in one picture and another vision in another. So he has a holistic philosophical outlook, I think, which is very praiseworthy, which I think is very admirable. And that, I think, it's hard to find in many other painters. I mean, even if you look at the great ones, like Rembrandt, for example, I mean, does he have a holistic philosophy behind his whole corpus?
Yeah, it's hard to say.
I'm not going to answer that question.
No,
but I mean, in the corpus of Nerdrum, you find this vision, which is this naked human in deserted landscapes, and they're all left to themselves. There's no authorities that help them out. There's no one to appeal to but each other. There's no gods helping them out. It's like a bare naked human vision of humanity, without any external authorities, as far as I can tell. And they judge each other, they help each other, and it's like, I think it's a deep, special form of humanism that he depicts. And it develops especially from the 80s and out. When he starts undressing his characters, take off their clothes, literally, more or less. So I think it's very, it's a unique exhibition that we have been able to see.
Yeah. And
did you feel the hope when you left there, or did you feel happier or sadder when you left the exhibition? Maybe not happier is the right word, but
I felt
uplifted?
more contemplative.
Yeah.
But in a positive.
There's a happy sense in that.
Yeah.
More contemplative. I actually felt more hope.
Yeah.
Yeah, like hope in humanity. So when you see the grotesque paintings, or you see he also has non-grotesque paintings, like beautiful touchings between people and taking care of each other, mothers taking care of the kids. And I just felt hopeful. Just like you see the best and the worst of humanity, and at least I just end up asking myself, have I made the best of my life when I left that room? Also just like admiring the ambitions, the whole project that we just talked about, like as an artist, it's very inspiring to see him as an artist, what he has achieved, but also the storytelling. It sort of left me pondering, like you said, more contemplative, but also more hopeful.
Yeah.
I want to do better after I left the room. I didn't want to do worse.
Yeah, I can see that.
And one more thing?
Yeah.
I'm not talking too much. Because I went to another exhibition. I'm not going to mention names, but I went to another exhibition a couple of days ago, and in Oslo. And it was a figurative painter. So it was more like, and it was also classical in many senses, in the sense I had like told the story. It was holistic. It wasn't like just a part of something. It was a whole story that's part of the classical tradition. You want to depict something, a happening that is not just cut off out of context. So but it was very figurative. But the faces were blurred, so all the characters were either seen from behind, or the faces were just like intentionally not made. So they were faceless characters, and that's also a sign of, I think, much contemporary paintings, that they don't focus on the more deep human aspect, which we get through faces. And I think Odd Nerdrum wrote about this in the book as well, because I think in the new Nerdrum book, because I think the faces are very important for Nerdrum's art. Because when you see the paintings, you see like living people there. And when I went to this exhibition, I saw like people walking and there was things happening, but there were no faces. I felt this like distance and indifference to what was going on, because they were all faceless.
That's interesting.
So I didn't care about the characters in the same way as I do when I walk and look at the paintings of Nerdrum. I see these characters and I start caring about some of them in a way that I would never do with these faceless people. And I think that's the human aspect I was talking about in a lot of his corpus, that you see real people and they're not hidden. They're like disclosed rather than hidden. So it's not like supposed to be like this mysterious what's going on. It's just like you see it and it hits you.
Yeah. And that relates much to my favorite painting at the exhibition is the Sisyphus painting, and that is so direct. It's the opposite of the indifferent or care.
So this is when he pushes the heavy rock up.
Yeah, he has just pushed up the rock up the mountainside and knows that he has to continue the work and roll it down again, and it's in that intense look, and he looks right through you. Yeah. It's to me it's very the character almost attacks you. Yeah. And it's impossible to hide from it or to not care about it. Yeah, yeah. And that is something that I find very, very inspiring with Nerdrum's paintings, is that they are so humanistic, like you said, but in such a direct way. It's the characters are there. They are suffering. Yeah. They are loving. They are struggling, and all of this just hits you. Like it's the human condition that you see in so many aspects, and I think that might be one reason why the exhibition has had that many react on the grotesque, that they call it, because I think our culture today is much removed from the humanistic, from the it's in many ways dehumanized. You can everything that are on office walls, it's not drawings or paintings or pictures often by humans. Yeah. It's often some color, something that is, it's very much is abstract and very much is kind of flat in emotion. Yeah. When it comes to other kinds of culture as well, and therefore I think it can be some kind of almost intimidating for many to see naked people around, and
I think you also notice that when you walk into the exhibition, you notice people they're in this like almost like sacred mood. When you walk, listen to what they talk and how they talk, they whisper. They show a respect for the circumstances they're in a whole different way than if you walk on to a more abstract exhibition. And I think also this is I totally agree with you. This is very, you can't go in, look at them and go out without looking, so to speak, without looking up, without being somehow in some way moved, because it's so direct and intense. And if I noticed this, I went to a different Nerdrum exhibition a couple of years ago, and I went to look at the paintings. I was pictures and painting. There was a couple of hours, went back to the hotel, and the hotel was decorated by another artist, which was figurative, but much more modern and abstract in the sense there was no faces, the figures were sort of like vague, you weren't sure what it was, and there wasn't really any events going on, actions going on in the paintings. And it was, when you walked into the hotel afterwards, everything just like was removed from you. You didn't care, it didn't affect you in a way. But when you went to see the Nerdrum pictures, it sort of affected you. You couldn't not care. You could say you didn't like it or care in a negative way, but you had to care. And I think that's a great virtue. You can go into many exhibitions and just not care, either positively or negatively, and just not react. You just couldn't care less. But that's impossible here.
I have often thought about how it would be to live in ancient Greece, and especially with the tragedies. How that was part of your upbringing, as I imagine it in my romantic view of ancient Greece, but that they saw these tragedies, and to me, Nietzsche's book *The Birth of Tragedy* was it was the first philosophy book that I really cared about, and and I'm still affected by his view on tragedy, that it's that you look into this dark well and see some glimpse of the deeply dark human, and it shakes you, and you need this shaking up, and then you can go back to life and maybe lighten it with some comedy and everything. But this upshaking, I think that's very healthy for the human life, and I think that's we lack that in society today, and perhaps that upshaking is what some people react to.
I agree, and I think you need it, as you said. I think it sort of makes you, it gives you, brings you in contact with emotions and mental states that you wouldn't have been in otherwise in normal life. So, like when you walk in and see the painting where they eat each other that we talked about earlier, it's not normal to see that in everyday life today, at least not in Oslo. and when you walk in and see that painting, you react to it in many ways, positively and negatively. You have to react to it, and then you experience some emotions of cannibalism that you would never have experienced in ordinary life. And if all the exhibitions, if all the paintings in society were faceless and very vague, and it wasn't sure whether it was cannibalism or not, and then you would never get that direct contact with that emotion. You could imagine it and so on, but it wouldn't hit you in the same way. So it has to be realistic enough to get that upshaking, as you said. And Aristotle mentions this too in the Poetics. Like the tragedy is sort of a way of getting in contact with these emotions, but also it's sort of a releasement of emotions that we wouldn't otherwise release. And that's healthy, and that cultivates you, and that brings you up as a human to be more all-rounded and have a broader spectrum to play on. So I think you're right. I totally agree. We shouldn't agree too much, but I agree. And I think that's the virtue. I mean, in order to get that effect, so it has sort of like that kind of art that has that effect has an upbringing aspect to it. It sort of like cultivates people. It educates us in a way. But and you need the classical figurative style to do that. Because if you won't get that effect by abstract paintings, for example. So if you look at the greatest abstract paintings like Rothko and Pollock and these very interesting abstract painters, they never have that upbringing aspect to it. They never have that immediate touching you with something you just can't avoid. It doesn't have that releasement. It has more of a wonder and puzzlement and what's going on with that color, that just you can look into it and you stare into the infinity and you don't know what you're looking at. It's interesting and fun to do that sometimes, but it will never have that effect that a really good classical figurative painting has, that just hits you with the story and you have to take it in somehow.
Yeah.
And that cultivates you as a human, I think. So I think that's why it's very important that it's done in that style, a classical figurative style. Because there's no other art form that can do it in the same way.
And then it's another interesting topic is the timelessness and how to reach that, or maybe not absolute timelessness, but something that is eternally human or universal, that reaching towards that, at least trying to depict something that is valid, that it is recognizable over generations.
Yeah.
That is also an aspect that is I think making the paintings or the stories more essential in the literal meaning of the word, picking out the essence of the human by ripping off their clothes that you talked about, and ripping the landscape and just trying to get to the core. And Nerdrum has said that he's making characters from the kingdom of death, because that is the highest form of tragedy. And the way I read that is that it's that when removing all these kind of things from that is recognizable for this time or this culture or this whatever is part of making it more eternal.
Yeah.
And
he does have some references though, like a rifle and a wheelchair. And a lot of the people I've been with at the exhibition, they point out the hat. One of the characters has a somewhat contemporary baseball hat.
Yeah.
So he does have some references, but it's, as you said, all taken out of contemporary context. And the magic is that it still appeals to you in a very close and direct way. So you just like immediately see the characters and what's going on, and you relate to it, even though it's not in our time. And I think that's the magic trick. I mean, that's why old Greek sculptures still appeal to us, because they're more or less naked or have very eternal clothing like a dress, or and it just feels like it could have been right now. And I think that's the magic. If you paint a picture of something today in the clothing, in the context, with the right expression, when they're on their like newest iPhone, or you sort of locate it very directly in a place, it might not be very recognizable in another context at another time. And the way he does it, Nerdrum does it, is to just create this context where this is just in a way contextless. It doesn't have time, and still manage us to feel something when we see them. And that's the magic of it, I think. That's what makes it really great. Like I think it's going to be recognizable in 500 years, and it would have been recognizable 500 years ago. And it is recognizable today. And I think that's very impressive. And some people at the exhibition also asked, is this in the past or in the future? These paintings, these happenings. And some people said it's after the apocalypse. After the end of the civilization. And some people were saying, I think it's after something horrible happened and they have to start all over again. But I think it's actually just in a different universe. It's like Star Wars. It's not neither past nor present. It's just somewhere else in a different timeline. Because it's that's how I interpret the paintings, at least. It's a parallel universe. It's not before or after our timeline. It's not on our timeline at all. But still, he manages to make it feel super relevant, or at least make us see ourselves deep inside in that painting. And
and that's a very classical mindset to have this this idea of making something that touches the viewer, that makes the viewer react, but not making it the public react because it's something from our time, or because it's something recognizable that puts it in this culture, this political context, this time, and it's a way of making it more universal. And it's interesting that Aristotle talks about why Homer is the greatest poet, because he doesn't mix in his own voice. And that's so different from the current aesthetics that is all about expression, and all about not, of course, the personal expression, but also something about, I would say you can interpret that and to reach broader, that it's not only the personal expression, but also it can be personalized by referencing to the time, to the culture, but by removing all that, trying to make this parallel universe that makes it more valid through time. And it's not right because Aristotle said it, but it's still just interesting that he points that out as a value. And
that's the Euthyphro problem for Aristotle.
What? It's
the Euthyphro problem for Aristotle. Is it right because he said it, or does he say it because it's right? But I mean, there's these divergent views on the point of art as well, or painting, the state painting, because some people think it should reflect the time it's in, the period, or the time period, or the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time, should reflect and comment on that. And others think it should not do that at all. It should rise above the time it's in, the contemporary context, and say something more lasting and internal and deeper in a sense than just comment on something that's going on right now. I think there's some purpose to both. I think it's good for people to see some reflection of the time they're in, but I don't think I wouldn't say that becomes the greatest art, because it's forgotten as soon as the time change, more or less. But I think there's some value to it. But at least I think about great art, or art to the greatest heights, that's not the one that's commenting on what's going on right now. That's sort of like a newspaper. It doesn't last. But the greatest novels, it's not like a newspaper. It's something that says something about us, that, teach us something and makes us reflect again and again. And a newspaper article doesn't do that. And I don't think a painting that just has this immediate recognition of the place and the people I hang out with is fun. But it's fun to see once, but it's not something I would go back to again and again to contemplate, what it means to be human. So it's sort of like talking about Nietzsche, you mentioned earlier. He hated newspapers and the media. He hated it because everything was going so quick, and they were just commenting on things. They didn't think things through. Language was horrible. He hated the media, and he loved eternal art. And I think there's a point to that. That's sort of like the same point. You need the newspaper in a sense, but you don't want that to be all there is. And the same, I think, with it's good to have some abstract, that someone does an abstract painting in a fun way, and it's good that someone paints something contemporary, but that's not all you want. That's not what's going to become the greatest, most important art. And so I think in our time, if we can complain about our time a little bit, I think its problem is that there's a wrong percentage. I mean, I would love to, I've always said that I think there should be something like 60, maybe 70% classical, traditional, eternal works on art, people working on classical art, and there should be something like 20, 30, 40% people experimenting with new things. Because it keeps things fresh, and you have to justify why you do it the old way. But nowadays it's the opposite. I think that's the problem. That if you go to exhibitions in Oslo, 98% of them is non-classical figurative art. It's contemporary stuff, modernistic art. And I think that's the problem. I mean, you have to really dig to find the good classical figurative exhibitions, but you don't even have to look to find the modern exhibitions. And I think that the balance is tipped a little bit in the wrong direction. But I wouldn't say it's worthless, but it's just not teaching me too much. If I can be that. Don't you feel the same? Do you think there's enough?
No, it's things are lacking. It's there is great potential.
There's great potential. It hasn't been released yet.
I'm more curious about this timelessness or this universal. What we have already talked about ripping off clothes and making it appear as if it was in a parallel universe or in a different universe. What else do you think are parts of Nerdrum's paintings that make them timeless in the way of appealing to people? Not only timeless, but more universal. That people from a totally different culture, totally different background, and young children, old people can see in the painting and something touches them.
Yeah, I think it's the deepest question to ask when you look at his paintings, because I think it's without doubt he does capture something, right? He does capture some actions, some characters, some happenings that just stands the tooth of time, I think is the expression. It's just going to last for a very long time. So what is it that he does? That's the very good question. And I think he manages somehow to provide the exactly the right balance between the particular concrete happening of something and the abstract general happening of something. So, for example, if he painted you, so this would be a classical case. If he painted you, there's two ways. So if a classical figurative painter painted you, there's two things that could happen, at least two things. They could paint you, and we saw you in the painting, and we saw that it was you, and we saw that it was you at a certain time in your life, and everyone was like, "Oh yeah, that's Carl, when he was young and beautiful." That's him. And then, but there's another way you could do it. It's you paint you, and we see that it's you, but we also see that it's a human. So we see that it's something more than just Carl. It's not just you there and then, but it's you as a human. And so that raises it to a more general level. But it doesn't make it abstract. It doesn't make it like humanity as such that we don't know how to depict. It's a character. It's you even. But the portrait has something that raises it above just the concrete here and there. And this is what Rembrandt, for example, manages so well when he paints portraits. You see that it's more than just that person there. We don't really care if it's his housemate that is painted or his kids, because we see humans there. So to find that balance, to not make it too general and too abstract so we don't recognize anything, because then we're less moved. If we don't recognize anything in the painting, we're less moved. But if it's too concrete and too particular in the time and place, we also lose the recognition after a while, because it's out of our time and out of our place. So I think what he manages, which is just somewhat magical, is to find that balance between the concrete particular individual that you see there, because that's what you see in his paintings. It's like a person. It's looking at you and you feel it's alive. And the skin is glowing and the eyes are looking at you. But he does it in a way that doesn't connect it to a unique person, and it doesn't remove it from us as persons. So he finds that magical balance. And that's what I'm the most impressed by, how he does it. because I try to learn how to draw, and it's very difficult to get that right. One thing is to make it look like you. I mean, that's a technical thing you can learn pretty easy, to make it look like you. Get the shapes right and shadows so everyone can say, oh, I think that's Carl. That's pretty easy. But to make that, to raise above that, and in addition paint something where people see, that's Carl, but there's more to it. There's some emotions, there's some expression, there's some humanity in there. And that's what he manages to do. And he somehow finds that balance. And I think it's just magical how he does it. I don't know exactly how he does it. I would have done it myself if I knew that. But it's like he manages to get the exact right information to strike that balance. And that's what makes it last. So you couldn't do it with an abstract painting because we wouldn't recognize the humanity in it. We would just ponder and puzzle by it, but we wouldn't see anything. So we wouldn't get that recognition, which I think is very important. But it also wouldn't work with too realistic paintings. Hyper-realistic paintings would just immediately look like you, and we see that it's you, and we see that age of you, and we see everything about you in it. Then it also loses some of that magical, eternal human aspect. And I think that's why he managed to strike that balance, and that's the magic, I think.
But if we try to dig in the magic...
I forgot. That's what I was going to say, that it can't be too abstract, but the hyper-realistic paintings, which is more or less like a photograph, photography, it couldn't capture that because it would be too particular. It would be like, it's a picture of that. But you want to say, it's a painting of Carl as a human being that I recognize in the year 3050. That's when you hit the strike, the balance that sort of captures the human aspect, the humanity of it. And so I think that's the magical trick, and how he does it is, I don't even think he knows it himself. I think it's partly an practice, like technical practice over years and years, and you get this implicit knowledge that somehow you just does it, and you understand what you're doing, of course, but it's not easy to put it into words. It's something that you trained, and you become the master at it. But it's like, explain how you tie your shoelaces in words. It's very difficult. But you know how to do it. But you take the one, you take the other, you make a circle, you put it. It's very difficult to explain how to tie your shoelaces. I think it's somewhat like that. You exercise, you become the master, but it's very hard to put it into words.
But then again, it can be very useful trying to do it. And I think
and that's what we just did.
I'm not sure, but I'm trying to analyze what it is, and we have already been through taking off clothes to not make the clothes be disturbing in the sense of making it belong to a certain time or culture. But then I also think one aspect is to make this mix between the that you talked about, the concrete and the abstract or eternal. I think that partly aspects of that is the uplifting of the human, where he uses unique techniques that are making the head smaller than it in reality is. And that you can see some characters from below and some from above at the same time, making this effect on the viewer, and you can see the landscape as if you were high above, but then you see the human as if you were beneath.
It bends the horizon. And feet are bigger, arms are longer.
So trying to uplift the human by using techniques. And also this capturing of expressions that I really think requires certain, not only a technical skill, but also some kind of empathy or an empathetic skill.
Yeah.
Not empathy as such, but an empathetic skill that I think, for instance, Edvard Munch had. He had the ability to capture some moods or characteristics in very few strokes.
Yeah.
And then also being aware when you see it.
Yeah.
Some people are very observant when seeing how people look that day, or then manage to capture that, and that's also psychological tricks.
Yeah, you have to see people. You have to like see through them in a sense. I mean, you have to be sensitive to aspects that other people don't see. You have to be sensitive to aspects that are common between you and me. Like what's common to us when we do some things? Well, capture that common aspect. So you have to be very observant. And I've tried to learn how to draw portraits. And when you do that, the funny thing at least I experienced when I tried to learn how to draw portraits is that all of a sudden you look at people differently. So when I try to draw a portrait of someone I know, so I've drawn a portrait of my son, for example, and all of a sudden you look at the person differently because you look for things that you normally don't look for.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden I stand there and I look at my mom and I go, wow, you have those wrinkles, you have that, I've never seen that before. You start to look at them differently. And that also makes you look at the person differently because you see aspects of them that you didn't see in the ordinary routine-based day. And I think that's what you have to do to manage to capture the eternal human aspect that Nerdrum does, for example. You have to observe and see the commonalities between humans and between actions, but also see the unique of these people that makes them unique individuals, to capture that and combine it.
Yeah.
That's the magic of it. And I think it's deeply philosophical to manage to do that. You have to really see things. You can't just like walk around and do your routine. You have to like actually sit back and chill and see. I think that's very true. And have to like see what's going on with people to capture it. In order to see what lasts as well. If you just see your friends right here, right then, you don't capture the eternal thing. So you have to like raise your perspective above the individuals. So that's there's a German word Bildung, in Norwegian is dannelse, and in English I think the best translation is cultivation.
Yeah.
So you cultivate the human, just like you can cultivate your plants and you can cultivate your animals, your livestock, and you can cultivate the human. You can educate the human and make it become the best it can. That's sort of the idea. So you have an image of what the human is supposed to be, and you try to make yourself into that. That's when you become cultivated. And that involves raising the perspective that you have on things. So you have to see, when we have a conversation like this, I can just act in here and now, but in order to be cultivated in a conversation, we have to realize how to have the conversation so that it can be a good conversation. And in order to do that, to see that, you have to see what's common to conversations that are good and what's common to conversations that are bad. So you have to raise your perspective and see the commonalities. Yeah. And that's what you have to do to make an eternal painting of a human too. You have to see what's common to the great human acts, what's common to the horrible human acts. And that's cultivating yourself. Yeah. And when you paint paintings that manage to do that, like Nerdrum does, you sort of, as I see it, you cultivate humanity. You make us see the perspectives that we should see. And that's a great achievement. And I think that's what's missing in our world.
And that's also what makes it
I flew off there. But I think it's true. I think it's genuinely true. Yeah. So I think it should be said. Damn it. Do you agree, or?
Yeah.
Does it make sense, or am I?
Yes, it does. And that's also what makes it philosophical project, because that's the task of philosophy as well, to see the universality of actions, of things, of conditions, and that's also what, going back to Aristotle again, that he takes this, shows the difference between history and poetry. That poetry is more philosophical because it shows the more universal aspects, while the history is more concrete, showing. Yeah.
But also we call this like at the university where I work at the university, and at the university there we have some disciplines, we call them like dannelsesfag. It's like cultivation disciplines. So like literature, art, history, philosophy, a lot of the humanities. They're called they're disciplines that cultivates us because they make us raise the perspective. So even when you study history, you study the Second World War, for example. So you study the causes of it, what happened. You go through the archives. You study the history of the war. And why do we want to do that? Well, we want to do it because it makes us understand war as a phenomenon. But you don't want to just study the Second World War. You want to study the first one as well, and the third one when that comes around. You want to study them all, and then see what's common to them. So history as well gives you a cultivated look. It raises your perspective. So when you've seen one war, you see all of a sudden in the next war that, well, you know, it's happening again. So you study history to learn, to understand what's going on right now. And literature as well. You read a novel to understand humans, to get empathy, to get perspectives you wouldn't get otherwise. So you read these novels, you read 10 different novels, you see that they all pick up a line of thought that you wouldn't have thought otherwise. It's cultivated yourself. You raise the perspective. And I think that's the importance of these things. That's why we should study the classics and not just like look at what's going on right now. So I think you said somewhere at some point that you never read new books.
Yeah.
You only read old books?
Yeah.
Is that right?
At least 100 years old.
Yeah, and then you can pick the good ones much easier.
Yeah.
So you don't waste time reading 5 bad ones before you get a good one.
Yeah.
So you wait a couple of years. 100 years is a long time, but you can wait.
Yeah, well,
not
50,
many people can wait that long.
Sometimes 50.
But you wait at least some years
Yeah.
to see which books are forgotten. Now, maybe a good book will be forgotten because we just didn't see it. But I mean, that's a risk to take.
Yeah, and it's a short life.
Yeah.
To me, it's only practical reasons, because...
I totally agree with you. I think that was a good point. I don't bother reading too much contemporary novels either. It's a waste of time.
Yeah.
And it's same with newspapers. About Nietzsche and newspapers. I hardly read daily newspapers. It's just a waste of time because it's constant information flow, and it gives you something, what's going on right now, here and now, especially online. The news is just like updated every 5 minutes. It's a complete waste of time. I can do nothing about what's going on right now the next 5 minutes. I'll do my thing, and on Friday I'll sit down and read a newspaper that has thought a little bit about what they're writing.
But then, on the other hand, Ibsen read only the Bible and newspapers at the end of his life.
Yeah, but imagine the newspapers back then.
Yeah.
It was slow.
Yeah, and
I mean, imagine Ibsen scrolling the news on his phone today, every day. That would like ruin his writings.
Yeah, but it's also I imagine that he read it to see the universal aspects of it.
Yeah.
Maybe it's making an idol of him, but I imagine that he was so into his place, writing realistic place, that he got inspiration from the newspapers and from listening to conversations that other people had. And
I think that's important. I mean, you have to look around you, what's going on right now, and get some, in order to be seeing people as well, and understand psychology, and get people to, see what's common to people. You have to look at what's going on. So you can't ignore your own time completely, because the danger then is that you lose touch with it, and you can't recapture what you want to recapture. But my point is more how extreme it has become, like the newspapers and the flow of information in real time that we're supposed to follow the whole time. Yeah, it takes a lot of time and attention, And I think it's enough to scroll some headlines in the morning to see if there's another war going on, and then wait until Friday and read like a newspaper over the weekend that analyzes it a little bit. And I think that's sufficient. All the information you get in between, it's not bringing anything interesting to the table. It's just an addiction. It's sort of like, okay, was it 10 people or 5 people? Well, okay, on Wednesday was 10, Friday was 12. It's not really super relevant if you want to create something that's supposed to last longer. So don't waste time on that. It's more, 2 handful, roughly. You get the point very easily. And I think that's something that's also about raising your perspective a little bit. Like, don't worry too much about the details here and now. But you can't lose touch with them completely. But raise your perspective a little bit. It's very important, I think.
And that is also, raising the perspective is a very good way of saying it, I think, because I think you can be too caught up both in the present but also in the past.
Yeah.
So, for instance, I have a good colleague that is who is Italian, and she has moved to Norway. And she said that in Italy, everything is about history. You grow up with history. That's what matters. And then she said, and then I moved to Norway, and here it's only the present.
Yeah.
No touch with history at all, only the present. And she said, I need a balance. Yeah. So I have the luggage with the history from Italy, but then I have the present in Norway, and you need a balance. But even better, you need to raise your perspective and manage to see.
That's a good example, I think.
And also what it's easy to say. You mentioned reading history and learning from history, and it's easy for us to sit here and talk about it, but then we see again and again how difficult it is to actually manage to see the universality of, for instance, history. It's really a great art to manage to capture that. And then going back to Nerdrum's paintings, you trying to learn from history, why then do these wars happen again and again? It's the same happening, just in a different wrapping. And then managing to see beyond that wrapping is a very it's a hard skill.
I also think it would be less appealing to start a war if you knew how similar and lame it is to do the same thing again. So if you've learned and we've seen, okay, all over again, you do the same thing again, you go for your conquering that small part. It's sort of like, okay, haven't we learned anything? And I think it's important to do it, but I agree with you. It's very hard to learn from history. Imagine just in your own life. I mean, the same mistakes you make 5 years later, you were like, oh, didn't I learn this 5 years ago? So I think it's hard, but I think it's just what we have to strive for, right? In order to improve as a human. And it's what separates us, I think, from other creatures. Like the caricature of the opposite is a goldfish. It swims around it's in a bowl, it has one plant in the middle, it swims around, and every time it's a new plant to that goldfish. It doesn't remember the plant from the last time. So it's like, wow, great green plant, and then it goes around another one. And that's the opposite of the cultivated, raised perspective. But we have this ability to like swim around the plant and see the plant and realize it's the same plant. And so it shouldn't surprise us when we see the plant again. But somehow it does surprise people. But I mean, so if you look at the paintings of Odd Nerdrum again, it's that's the case where you have actually seen the plant, and then you paint the plant, and you show us that it's the same plant every time, and you realize, wow, it's that plant. Didn't even know it was that beautiful. Maybe that's a silly analogy, but It's a fun analogy.
Yeah. And you have also, I'm not sure for how long, but you are a philosopher who taught who are in the process of learning how to draw and paint, right?
Yeah, I've actually drawn a lot my whole life, but I over the last couple of years I've studied the painting and drawing more professionally, like philosophically, but also when you work on the philosophy of art, you want to, at least I want to understand it from the perspective of the painter and the drawer, not just as a theory. A lot of the philosophy of art is just theory about something, and I suspect that the theorists don't really know how to draw or know how to paint, or they just have all this like abstract relations and isms that they talk about. And so I want to learn how to draw and paint for real. I want to be like really good at it, so I can say, look, this is how you do it, and this is how hard it is. Like I want to realize and feel physically how difficult it is to paint Carl in a way that I see the human, and not just like in a slightly awkward way where I can see it as you, but there's something wrong with your eyes. I want to really know how to do that, and so I spent some years on that now, and I think it's very helpful to understand art and painting and drawing and also, as I said earlier, to just see things in a new way. I see you differently when I paint you or draw you than I would have if I just talked to you. And to know how to make those shadows and that sad look or the happy look, I just look at you differently. And I think that's just rewarding and enriching as a human to do that. It's like the Renaissance ideal where you're like, you know and realize that human has many aspects to it, and you want to know a little bit about it, all of them, and cultivate the whole human. And I think that's important.
Yeah, and
But you paint a little bit too.
Just a little bit, but by the same reasons, or for the same reasons that I found out that I didn't want to be this theorist that only talked about something I didn't know anything about, and but I've not been as extreme as you are.
Go to the extreme. But
we talked about it earlier that I find that many of the philosophers talking about aesthetics, they lack this ability of describing what they actually are talking about. So they can have very much that reaches into moral philosophy and some into epistemology, but then when it comes to aesthetics and trying to explain it, it becomes something so vague, something that is, it's showing humanity or something like that. And you then mentioned that why you think Aristotle's Poetics is so relevant and so much, or he hits the nail on its head in so few pages, because he hang out with the with the
right crew,
with the right crew, and actually talked about painting, about sculpture, in this group of people that where culture and painting and sculpture and theater and poetry were integrated parts of their lives.
I think imagine Athens in ancient Greece. It was very small. It was a very small town. It had city walls. Everyone basically knew who everyone was, at least which family they belonged to, and of course Aristotle probably hung out with he had to escape the city and move, and there was a lot of stress, I assume. But I think they hung out with different kinds of people, and they talked about different kinds of things. So he talked about history, he talked about geology, he talked about with astronomers, he talked to mathematicians, he talked to philosophers, and they talked with each other, right, in a very different way, I think, than in in our days, the universities are very specialized and very distinct disciplines. So a philosopher of art need not necessarily talk to an artist. He can just do philosophy of art because he enjoys art. But he doesn't have to talk to an artist at all, in theory. And I think there's some virtue to actually talking with and communicating with the different perspectives. So from the drawer or painter perspective, you have a different outlook on what you're doing than from the history of art perspective, where you see some commonalities, as we talked about. You make some isms and categories, and you try to place them in the same category because they look alike, they worked in the same way. And you try to structure history and the communities, but you don't need the perspective from the artist necessarily to do that. And I think it would be interesting to write the history of art from the artist's perspective, for example. I think there's less of that than there's the history of art from the theory perspective. And so I think this is also about just cultivating humanity. We want to understand it from the other perspective. And I think it's also a deeply human aspect of knowing how to do something and not just talk about it. And I think that's if everyone drew an hour every day, if Putin and Trump and the prime ministers of different countries, just to mention a few, drew an hour every day, I think the world would have been more calm. It would have been a more peaceful place, because there'd be less stress, there'd be less arguments. You were like, let's just get that eye right. And, and I think there's something about this very humanistic aspect to the to drawing or seeing it from the artist's perspective, because of all the things we talked about. You have to see it differently, you have to see it, what's common, and I think it's hard to see what's common and still not value it, for example. I think it's much easier to not care if you just see it as one thing and then can forget about it the next time you swim around the plant. It's much easier to not care about the plant. But if you see the plant for what it is, and you swim around it, and you realize it's the same plant, but you see it in a slightly different color, then you start caring about it very differently than when you just see it anew every time. And I think that's, so if I draw you, and I draw you again, and I draw you again, I see you very differently than if I just drew you once. And I think that's sort of the part that's missing from a lot of the discussions of art. And that I think I've learned from actually learning how to draw. You learn that it's a different perspective. And history of art, or the understanding of art, would maybe look different if we had that perspective as well. So I have a lot of students who come and they want to write a master thesis, for example, about something. And sometimes you have a student say, I want to write about the philosophy of physics. And so the first thing I ask them is, do you know any physics? And often they don't. They just think physics is interesting. And then I wonder, why do you want to write, what are you going to say about the philosophy of physics if you don't know any physics? Or philosophy of chemistry or anything? And over the last decade, it's been very popular to write about the philosophy of philosophy. So meta-philosophy is very popular. And I have students coming in their bachelor thesis, 2-3 years into their studies, and they say, I want to write about the philosophy of philosophy. And I'm like, you haven't done any philosophy yet. You should do some philosophy first, and then start to reflect on what this thing is. Learn the crafts first, and then start to meta-think about it. And I think so the direction is somewhat wrong. But I think you need both. You need to look at the meta in order to understand how to do it, but you also need to know how to do it in order to look at the perspective, what you're doing. But I think that's somewhat, the point is, long story short, the point is that I think that's missing somewhat in the philosophy of art, the other perspective. Knowing the crafts, do it from there, and then look at it from the other perspective and see what is this thing we call painting, what is this thing we call drawing. And if you could get that balance better, I think the world would be a better place.
Very, very grandiose.
Nothing less.
But about knowing the crafts, I remember I interviewed a Norwegian mathematician, Jens Erik Fenstad, and about philosophy of mathematics. And I remember he said that we talked about then abstract objects and mathematical objects, and he was, well, it's these philosophers, they complicate it too much. It's so and he had like clear answers to what the mathematical objects were, and that it was a language, and
but I think you need both, though. I mean, so I talk to some mathematicians, and I say, well, you know, if you ask a mathematician, are there prime numbers? They're going to be like, that's a silly question. You know, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. There are many prime numbers. But the philosopher wonder, are there really any prime numbers, or is that just a way of speaking? And then the mathematician's like, I don't know. So they know how to prove things, to talk about the different numbers, but philosophers often wonder about a slightly different question. So they think it's just like complicating things, but it's also a good question. Are there any numbers? Or is that just a way of talking? And I think, are there eternal paintings? Or is that just a flashy way of talking?
Oh, that was a very good transition.
Bringing it back down. And I think you can look at the new Nerdrum exhibition, and I think that's very good evidence that there are some eternal paintings. And then you can contemplate what that means, and that's what we've been doing. But I think it helps if you look at it from both perspectives, and because what I can say that what's often the problem with a lot of criticism in my mind, when you get art critics, what's wrong is they start discussing or evaluate a work, a novel or a painting, from a perspective that they don't reflect too much on. So for example, they start writing about a novel and they say what they think of the novel, without first settling what kind of novel it is, what kind of book it is. So you can't evaluate an apple and say it's a bad apple because it doesn't taste like an orange or a pear. You have to first define that this is an apple, so it has to be evaluated as an apple. And then you can say whether it's a good or bad apple. And I think the same with a lot of art works. You have to first look at what kind of art is this? What is this artwork supposed to be? And then you can say, is it good as such or bad as such? So, well, okay, this is a classical figurative painting. Is it a good classical figurative painting? You can't just then say, I don't like classical figurative paintings, because that's irrelevant. And you can't say, oh, it's boring. It's irrelevant. You have to evaluate it. Is it a good classical figurative painting? Does it have the classical structure? Does it depict the story? Does it have the composition principles that classical art has perfected over centuries? And then you can start evaluating whether it's doing that in a good way, or in an interesting way, or in a touching way. But you have to define it first. And this is also a lesson from Aristotle. I mean, you have to first say, this is a tragedy and not a comedy. And then you can say, is it a good or bad tragedy? Well, what is a tragedy? What is it supposed to achieve? Then you can say, does it achieve that? But a lot of the art criticism that you read is just, it starts out just evaluating it as art. And it's just nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. You have to like figure out what kind of art are we talking about. So I think you can evaluate an abstract painting and say, is it warm or cold? Is it something I can look at for a long time as an abstract painting without being bored? But if you evaluate it and you say, well, it doesn't tell me anything from human story, then you're evaluating it on the wrong premises. And the same the other way around. You can't evaluate a classical figurative painting as an abstract painting. So I think it's very important to get the right understanding of what you're talking about first. Definitions are important. They don't have to be precise, but they have to be like clear enough to say something meaningful. And don't remember why we talked about that, but it's
it was your transition to eternal paintings. And I think
so what is an eternal painting? What makes it eternal, like you asked?
So you're just turning the question back on me.
You can answer it.
But what strikes me with the exhibition is also the how the philosophy is, how Nerdrum's philosophy is apparent throughout the works, because this exhibits a life work. And you mentioned earlier that it shows an extreme persistence to keep to this classical figurative painting and keeping to this philosophy through so many years, and sticking to it. And I think that's maybe the core strength of Nerdrum, is to have the philosophy as a base. He is so passionate about philosophy. I remember the first time I met Nerdrum at the track conference. I said hello and said that I was Norwegian, and we talked, and he asked, so you're studying in the States, in Philadelphia, so is it a painting school? No, it's actually, I study philosophy. Oh, philosophy, well, and then started talking about Hegel and Aristotle and everything, and it shows, I think the exhibition shows living philosophy, or philosophy in practice, and that has also laid the foundation for continuous development, because you can learn so much from different philosophers, from the philosophies of different painters, and just taking all this knowledge into this large work.
Yeah, I agree. I think the philosophical picture that he gives us throughout the whole corpus from the late 60s, early 70s until today is very impressive. But I also think it's important to see that it's also developed.
Yeah.
So it's in the 70s, it was very social realism in the pictures. It was depicting these characters from the 70s. And it was very often a defense of the defenseless people. So there was very often a criticism of authorities, a criticism of the police, of the government. It was very often a criticism in the stories of the authorities and of abuse of power over more helpless people. And then later in the 80s, it's sort of like he undressed them, as we talked about, but also took away and stripped away the cultural references. But still, it's the same line of thought that goes through the whole thing, is the lack of authorities, and the lack of the criticism of authorities, or lack of authorities even, but also how we sort of just abuse and take care of each other. And there's like, so later in the 80s and 90s, he started to also remove all symbols of external authorities. Like there were no police anymore, there were no governments, there were just naked humans with very little clothing, handling each other. So it was sort of the same line of thought. You get the sympathy for the weak in all these pictures, like when a mother takes care of the child, you get the sympathy for the child. It's the love and caring and taking care of someone. Same with in the 70s, when the police abused their power in the stories, you've got the sympathy with the ones that were being abused. So it's the same line of thought that goes through it all, but it's developed in the sense that it become more and more eternal, as we talked about, and it's also become more and more concerned with like seeing, I think, deeper into the human psychology and less at the social events. So in the 70s, it was more social psychology that was going on, but now it's more like, I don't know how to put it, but it's more like pure psychology. It's not
interpersonal.
It's not so much social psychology in the sense of a community and a society anymore, but it's more like, I mean, there seems to be no society there. It's been like broken down, and it's just individuals interacting with each other much more. So, but I think that the philosophy that goes through it all is this like deep kind of humanism. You feel this sympathy for humanity, and we can like lower ourselves to, great depths, but we can also raise ourselves to great heights. And I think you can see both that distinction between the bad things we can do and the good things we can do. And it's independent of culture and society and the social roles so much. and it's more embedded in like pure psychological relations between individuals. So I think it's a very interesting philosophical project. I think it's a kind of anarchism, actually. I don't know if anyone too many have talked about this, but I think it's anarchism that you get here. Yeah. There's like, in the sense that there's no authorities. There's no, and you don't get much. Can't remember a single painting where there's sympathy for the authority. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think there's. So if we think of anarchism as this, like, there should be no authorities kind of picture, I think there's some kind of anarchism to this corpus, in the sense that we see that authorities are very often bad. Maybe, I don't know, I shouldn't say too much about that. I was just thinking right now, as if that's true. But yeah, it's something to think about. Yeah. Let's raise it as a question. Yeah. Is Nerdrum's paintings, the corpus, the whole thing, is it showing a kind of anarchism or not?
Yeah, I think maybe it's scenery. It's an anarchistic scenery, but not as a point in itself necessarily.
I don't think it's a defense of anarchism necessarily, but
it's
I agree with that. I think, but it exhibits. I mean, so anarchism is often misunderstood as just chaos, but I mean anarchism in the sense of the fact that authorities are bad unless they're embraced by everyone, right? So abuse of authorities is bad, but authorities doesn't have to be bad if I embrace it. So I can give you authority over me as long as it's voluntarily. So that could be a kind of anarchism. So I voluntarily hand some authority over to you and still be anarchistic. But then if you abuse it, I'm just going to take it back. Yeah. And I think in that sense, there's some anarchistic aspects to it. Because I certainly don't get much sympathy for abuse of power in his paintings. Maybe we can ask him.